Lecture 4, Spaced Practice and Retrieval Practice. Looking back on your school days, you can probably remember frantically cramming the night before a test. Maybe even staying up all night, rereading your notes over and over again, hoping it would somehow stick long enough to pass. And even though sometimes you still failed, I'll bet many times it worked. But even on the occasions when it did work, as soon as the test was over, what happened? How many times after the test was over did you immediately forget everything? How much of that content do you still remember today? So what was the point? Learning that way is tedious, anxiety-provoking, and perhaps most importantly, ineffective if you actually care about retention and understanding. So I ask again, why do we do it? Is it just plain laziness? Is it due to busy schedules and a mere lack of time to learn deeply? Or is it because we just don't know any better? Maybe it's all of those things. But that raises another question. Why should we care? After all, if strategies like cramming have worked in the past, why change now? The best answer I can give is to say that you may be limiting your own potential and shortchanging yourself if you're using ineffective strategies, not to mention wasting your time. It's also very possible that strategies that used to work aren't helping you right now. Maybe you're back in school or completing a certification course for your job, and maybe you find yourself struggling to remember the content. Or maybe you're trying to learn a new craft or a hobby. Or maybe you're watching someone else, like your kids, struggling to learn. Regardless of your circumstances, if you want to make the most of your time, improve your knowledge and skills, and remember things long term, then it's important to understand how our brains work. So today, I'm going to tell you about 2 strategies that research has repeatedly shown to be the most effective for learning: spaced practice and retrieval practice. I'll also give you some practical advice for how to implement both strategies. Neither one is probably new to you, but you might not be aware of just how helpful these strategies are, why they work, and why they are necessary given our natural cognitive limitations. Spaced practice, also known as distributed practice, is really less of a strategy per se and more of a schedule of studying that involves reviewing the same content over time or practicing the same skills on different occasions. Research consistently shows that we're better able to recall information when we learn it in multiple spaced-out sessions. But you also need to know how to study, and that's where retrieval practice or self-testing comes into play. Simply reading or listening to content isn't enough. You have to practice using it in effective ways. And that involves using deep processing strategies, testing yourself in multiple ways, and practicing in a way that mimics the actual performance environment. Used in conjunction, retrieval practice and spaced practice are the most effective methods for learning that last. So let's unpack what those strategies entail. We'll start with spaced practice. You've all probably heard advice against cramming, right? And many of you have directly experienced the stress and anxiety associated with cramming to study or to finish projects right before deadlines. You'd think that alone would be enough to stop us from doing it. But as I've noted, one of the reasons we fall into the cramming habit is that sometimes it works. Or I should say it works well enough so that we get by without major negative consequences. But what the research clearly and consistently tells us is that our learning is reduced when we engage in massed practice like that. For complex skills and learning objectives, our bodies and our brains need time to process and consolidate information. And learning is greatly improved when study or practice sessions are spaced out and separated by time and other events. Like I said, you probably know this on some level. Musicians, athletes, and even gamers understand this principle quite well, even if just intuitively. The reason they get better is because they practice over and over again. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, practice makes perfect, right? For most things, practice is a fundamental part of learning. Whether we're learning how to solve math problems, how to play an instrument, how to use a new software system, how to swing a golf club, or just trying to remember our coworkers' names, practice helps improve our performance. But it's also true that learning takes time. You might improve over the course of a few hours, but it's not enough to spend a single, long session practicing a skill to truly master it. Chess players don't become masters in a single day, just like athletes don't become MVPs in a day. You may have heard of the 10,000 hours rule, which was derived from the research of Anders Ericsson. In his often cited research studying musicians, Erickson found that it took, on average, 10,000 hours, or at least 10 years, of dedicated, deliberate practice to become an expert-level performer. That equates to almost 3 hours of practice per day. Now, most of us don't have the time or focus for that, but the good news is that we don't need to be expert-level performers. And with spaced practice, we can still show dramatic improvement in our skills in significantly less time. But with learning, it's also important to consider maintenance. If we want to retain our skills and acuity, then we need to practice those skills over time as well. In other words, we can't just learn once and then assume we're set for life. Distance runners and other athletes, for example, understand the importance of training and staying fit even during the off-season. Their workouts might not be as intense as when they're training for an upcoming event, but they continue to exercise and to practice in increments in order to maintain their endurance. On a related note, athletes also understand the importance of rest between workouts. You can only push your body so far before it runs out of fuel or simply breaks down. And the same is true for our minds. It's better to build up knowledge and skills in a gradual, consistent manner than it is to risk overwhelming the system, which can lead to anxiety, frustration, and forgetfulness. But in order to further convince you of the benefits of spaced practice, it might be helpful to take a step back and explain why it works in light of cognitive neurological research. There are 3 main principles you should know. 1, our brains can only handle so much information at once. 2, neural connections, or the pathways in our brains that reflect and otherwise create learning, take time to develop. And 3, well-practiced skills become easier and more automatic over time. To understand the first principle, you should know the difference between long-term memory and working memory. Long-term memory, as the name implies, is where we store information permanently, or at least semi-permanently, for later use. And long-term memory is subconscious. It's basically a mental filing cabinet where you store information that you're not currently using. Working memory, however, is the conscious part of your mind you're using when you are actively paying attention and thinking about something. And while long-term memory is theoretically limitless, our attention and working memory are seriously limited in capacity. This helps to explain why we often need quiet, distraction-free places to work and study, and why most of us can solve a simple math problem like 4 times 2 in our heads, but struggle solving a harder problem like 311 times 1,289 without writing it down. We can only think about so much information at once. The issue is that most everything we learn has to first go through our working memories in order to get to long-term memory. So working memory essentially serves as a bottleneck for learning. No matter how much information we're presented with at once, only a limited amount will actually get through at any given time. And too much information at once can potentially block the flow of all information through that path. In essence, cramming is the equivalent of dumping an entire bucket full of water over another container with a much larger capacity, but one that only has a small opening. Even though the second container has the potential to hold all of the water from the bucket and more, dumping all of that water at once only guarantees that most of it will be spilled. But taking that same bucket and being careful to pour a nice, slow, steady stream into the bottle opening ultimately reduces waste and ensures that more of the content is retained. In a similar fashion, too much content at once overwhelms your brain and makes it less likely that any of it will be retained. But like a slow, steady pour, spaced practice helps us control the amount of content that we process and ultimately makes learning easier and more efficient. To understand the second cognitive principle understanding spaced practice, you need some basic neuroscience. Our brains are composed of billions of cells called neurons. With each new experience, we form connections between those neurons. And with repeat experiences, certain connections and pathways get stronger over time. The stronger they get, the faster and the easier it is for us to think and to retrieve information from long-term memory and to perform learned skills. At the same time, pathways or connections that are not frequently used become weaker over time and may disappear. We call these processes neural plasticity, and research shows that our brains have the capability to rewire themselves in those ways throughout our lifetimes, which is actually pretty cool. because it means we have the capacity to learn new things no matter how old we are. But neuroplasticity doesn't happen overnight. Much like hiking trails in a forest, neural pathways are strengthened or weakened over time due to regular use or extended disuse. Cramming is the equivalent of trying to forge a single path through the forest in one day. Either you'll become exhausted from the effort and won't make it through, or you'll exert such little effort that the path itself never becomes very clear in the first place. And in either case, the path will just become overgrown again if it's only used once or too infrequently. Space practice is like walking the same path over and over again across many days until the path itself becomes clearer and easier to use. The more you practice retrieving information from your long-term memory, the stronger and clearer those pathways become, and the easier it will be to perform a learned skill in the future. The last principle, automaticity, refers to the finding that highly rehearsed information generally requires fewer mental resources over time. In other words, once information is efficiently stored in long-term memory and those neural pathways are sufficiently established, we can devote less working memory and attention to those skills. And therefore, we have more mental resources to devote to acquiring new skills. This principle helps to explain why learning something, such as how to ride a bike or how to read, initially takes all of our focus. And it's hard, but eventually becomes second nature. And even if it's been a while since you practiced those skills, it's generally easier to pick them up again later than it was to learn them from the start. If we go back to the forest analogy, it helps to explain why it's generally easier to upkeep the same path than it is to make an entirely new one. In sum, our brains are remarkable processors, but they can only process so much information at once, and it only becomes more efficient through repeated use. And this is why space practice leads to enhanced and longer-term learning. But how do you apply space practice? Let me give you 5 suggestions. First, make a plan that fits with your schedule. Everyone is busy. Everyone has a variety of obligations: work, family, social, and other. Sometimes we get opportunities to practice without much planning or intention, such as learning the names of our coworkers just from interacting with them on a daily basis. But sometimes we need to deliberately plan to practice what we're learning, or it just won't happen. And even though you might have some flexibility in your learning timeline, if you're serious about it, then you should prioritize it on your schedule. Use a calendar and make a point of designating specific times, spaced out at several points throughout the week or throughout the month, just for learning a new skill. Just as a coach would schedule practice sessions and teachers schedule class times. If you don't have a set due date for when you need to learn something, like a certification exam or a specific competition, consider giving yourself such a date and then work backwards from there to identify multiple days and times to study and practice. My second suggestion for space practice is this. In light of working memory limitations, try to break down complex learning tasks into smaller, more manageable components in terms of both time and content. As for time, the number of sessions you schedule or how long they should last, unfortunately, I can't give you an absolute prescription, but I can say that those decisions should be based on the complexity of the skill or content relative to your current ability level. More difficult tasks will likely require more frequent practice sessions, at least initially. But it's also important that you give your brain time to rest in between. So try to schedule these sessions at least 1 or 2 days apart at the start. Also keep in mind that if you practice for too long in any session, your attention will wane, and that means you'll retain less information over time. A practice session needs to be long enough to ensure focused engagement. So I also recommend that you limit your practice sessions to 30 or 60 minutes at a time. You can also break down the content into smaller steps and then gradually combine them over time. For example, if you're learning to play chess from scratch, you might start by simply memorizing the movements of the pieces, and then add and practice a new strategy each week, and eventually move on to studying theories. In other words, with each study or practice session, you should include new content and skills to review, as well as material from your previous session. It's important to understand that space practice is not simply practicing different content or skills at different times, such as reviewing Chapter 1 in Week 1, Chapter 2 during Week 2, etc. Instead, space practice would entail something like studying Chapter 1 during Week 1 and then studying chapters 1 and 2 during week 2. Keep in mind that the key part of space practice is repetition, and so the cumulative nature of these practice sessions is crucial because that's what creates the repeated exposure. And each exposure, especially after those built-in delays, is what strengthens your memory for the content. Which brings me to my third suggestion related to space practice. Make every effort to minimize distractions during your study session. As I will explain in another lecture, research has shown that people simply cannot attend to 2 complex activities simultaneously. And multitasking is a dangerous myth that leads to less learning and more time wasting. 30 minutes of focused, uninterrupted practice will be more beneficial than 2 hours of distracted practice. As for suggestion number 4, once you've made and started enacting your practice schedule, be sure to monitor your learning and performance and adjust as needed. For example, as you gain proficiency, you can gradually increase the length of time between your practice sessions. It's important to stay flexible and to use your own learning as a guide. If at some point you find yourself forgetting or unable to recall important details or unable to perform certain skills, then you should make practice sessions more frequent or reduce the amount of content you're practicing. Remember, the goal is to challenge, but not to overload the system. Sometimes you'll find that it's better to take a step back and spend more time practicing the lower level skills and content before moving on. Don't rush. Quality is more important than quantity when it comes to laying that foundation. You ultimately want to create strong connections and pathways that need less frequent tending over time. My 5th and final suggestion is this. Combine space practice with effective retrieval practice, also known as self-testing. As I mentioned at the start of this lecture, space practice refers to more of a schedule of studying, whereas retrieval practice gets more at the methods. And the way you study matters just as much as the frequency. Research shows that practice testing specifically leads to greater remembering than any other method like rereading or space practice alone. With this in mind, let's spend a few minutes on retrieval practice. Self-testing is useful because it provides information about how well you are learning, which enables you to more effectively make adjustments. In learning, many times we fall victim to the familiarity bias, where we assume that just because we understand something as we are engaging with it, that we will actually remember it down the line or in a different context. But just because I learned your name and face at a party, that doesn't mean I'll remember your name, let alone recognize you weeks later if I run into you at the grocery store. In the same way, memorizing chess strategies is often different than being able to effectively employ them during an actual match. Examples of retrieval practice include creating flashcards, taking practice quizzes, and engaging in scrimmages. Even simply demonstrating or talking about what you're learning to a friend or colleague can be a form of retrieval practice. But as with all learning strategies, the details matter. To be optimally effective and useful, it's important to use retrieval or testing strategies that promote deep processing, that mimic the actual testing or performance event, and that challenge you in different ways. Deep processing strategies include things like organizing the content in a meaningful way, creating analogies or making connections to other things you've learned, explaining ideas in your own words, and actually teaching it to someone else. The more you practice memorizing and recalling the content in deep ways, the more it will stick long term. As noted, it's also important to practice in ways that mimic the actual performance event. So the best way to learn chess is to practice playing chess against other people, just as the best way to learn a new sport is through games and scrimmages, just as the best way to learn calculus is to practice solving problems. But you also want to attend to the details. For instance, if you're taking a course that includes exams, you should inquire about the overall format of those exams. If the format includes multiple choice questions, then practice with multiple choice questions. If the format is mostly open-ended essays, then you should practice writing open-ended essays. Different question types and formats require different strategies and ways of thinking. And it's a mistake to assume that studying in one way will automatically prepare you for another. Another consideration relates to the performance environment. For example, if the assessment is timed, then you should test yourself with the same time constraints. If the assessment's conducted in a public space, then testing yourself in the same or similar space might also be helpful. Likewise, if a race will occur in a hot and humid location, then you should occasionally skip the air-conditioned treadmill practices and actually practice running outside when it's hot and humid. You won't be able to perfectly recreate the performance environment, but you want to ensure that you're preparing in an authentic manner when you can. Lastly, don't forget the importance of challenging yourself. In addition to using deep learning strategies over shallow ones, you should plan to over-prepare or to overlearn. Overlearning involves rehearsing a skill or content even after you think you know it, and it helps to combat our natural tendency to overestimate our abilities. Overlearning also helps contribute to the development of automaticity. Now, by encouraging overlearning, I don't mean that you should overexert yourself. As I explained earlier, you need to give your mind and body breaks and time to process. But that doesn't mean you should take it easy. If you really want to learn and grow, then you need to aim slightly above your ability level and push yourself out of your comfort zone. Learning goals should be attainable, but still challenging. Setting goals that can be achieved with little or no effort will not only limit your learning, but will also make it harder to stay motivated and mentally engaged. So you might want to start kind of small, but then look for ways to make your practice sessions more challenging. For example, once you start to become familiar with a new skill or content, challenge yourself by expanding the time between practices. The best time to study is actually once you start to forget. It's easier to remember things short-term or when you've recently engaged. But again, if your goal is long-term learning, then you want to test yourself in long-term ways. Other ways you can make self-tests even more challenging are doing things like practicing true recall without the use of learning aids like notes. Keeping resources handy during the learning process can be useful, much like training wheels on a bicycle, but at some point you've got to be willing to try without them. And while you're struggling to remember, avoid the temptation to immediately go back to those aids or to look up the answers. In other words, you want to make yourself suffer with it a little bit. The harder it is to remember something while practicing, the harder it will be to forget it later. In other words, the more mental effort it takes to recall, the more firmly the information will be subsequently planted in your memory. You should also make a point of testing yourself in different ways. For example, if you were studying the content from this lecture, you might practice defining space practice and/or explaining why space practice is important relative to the concept of neuroplasticity, or giving advice to someone on how to implement it. All of those exercises pertain to the same topic, but require different types of explanations, some of which might be harder than others. You should also test yourself or practice in different contexts. Our brains make subtle connections between what we're studying and whatever background features accompany that learning experience. So the learning environment itself can also serve as a retrieval cue that makes learning easier. That's why simply practicing in a different location can up the challenge level too. When the context is varied, your brain is forced to create new connections, which enriches the memory and makes forgetting less likely. One last strategy to make retrieval practice challenging involves varying the type of materials or skills practiced in a single session. We call this interleaving. For example, a math student might alternate between solving different types of problems instead of grouping similar problems together. It's much harder for your brain to jump around and to have to adjust by determining when and how to apply what you've learned to different situations than it is to repeatedly apply the same content over and over again by studying in blocks. Interleaving forces your brain to retrieve information in different ways, which ultimately creates and strengthens those neural pathways. Interleaving does for your brain what cross-training does for athletes' bodies. And the advantages of this approach can be striking. For example, Doug Rohrer and Kelly Taylor conducted experiments with children and adults, and they found that interleave practice for solving math problems sometimes led to more than double the performance compared to studying in blocks. In conclusion, although we often look for quick fixes and shortcuts, true learning usually takes time and practice. It can sometimes take days, weeks, or even months to demonstrate the positive effects of the strategies I've described today. But it's also important to realize that effective strategies don't always take more time or more effort than the supposed shortcuts we often rely on. Again, spacing your learning into 3 30-minute sessions a week while using good retrieval practice strategies is more likely to be effective and is less mentally and physically draining than practicing for 8 straight hours the day before an event. And research in neuroplasticity shows us that it's never too late to develop new mental and physical habits. So while you may spend more time up front learning how to use these strategies, over time, they will become more automatic and more efficient, and you'll see improvements in the quality and longevity of your learning.